Before you ask me 1,000 questions about the decisions that I made, if you'll permit me to discuss a little bit about the grading process and then also a little bit about the corrections process. This is the first time many of you have had me, and so I consider this to be the first dance. Every time I have a test with a new professor, it's like dancing with somebody for the first time. I don't know if you've ever had that experience when you go to dance with somebody for the first time, and you think you told them to go this way, and they think you told them to go this way, and you just kind of hit feet, and it feels kind of awkward. And then the second dance is a little bit less awkward, and by the third or fourth dance, you're actually like moving in the same rhythm. I always like to think that exams are kind of like that. I said a bunch of stuff before the test. I gave you some directions that were, in my mind, very clear, but that doesn't necessarily mean that my directions correlated with the way that you thought about the test. Now that we've finished that, in terms of your first draft, I like to say that this is where the real learning begins. We talked a little bit about, I think, the idea of tests. So I like to say that in-class STEM exams, in my opinion, do a very bad way, measure 4 things. 4 properties of learning, 4 categories of thought and action. And I like to think about them in kind of order of difficulty. The first thing that we claim is that it is necessary but not sufficient to understand the material that we've talked about and to understand it at kind of a deep level. The second one we talk a lot about is recall or remembering. In this class, I tend to actually give you a huge study skill for this, which is your note sheets. But did anybody notice that even if you had the note sheets, it wasn't always easy to navigate the information? Note sheets are very helpful to categorize information, but it also, regardless of whether or not you have note sheets or not, it's still super useful to be able to remember stuff. And then the third level of this is what we might call problem-solving skills, which is the ability to think on your feet in a technical problem. And then the fourth one is called test-taking skills. So you might call this performance and anxiety management. Management skills. One of the reasons that I'm so serious about the exam corrections process is that I tend to believe we conflate understanding with good grades, and they don't deserve to be conflated. The claim of most of my college instructors when I went through college is if I got a good grade, it must mean that I understand, and if I got a bad grade, it must mean that I didn't understand. That was often not true. There were great classes where I got very, very good grades and I didn't understand much, and there were classes where I didn't get a strong grade as I wanted, and I understood a lot about that class. And the reason that there is sometimes a non-correlation or a disconnect between the grade that we earn on an exam and the knowledge that we have in our head is because, in my opinion, exams actually do all 4 of these at once, and all of these are very complex processes. Meaning to say that every single one of these individually is necessary but not sufficient. You need it. You need to understand the material to perform well, but if you only understand the material and you don't remember it, generally won't do well. Same thing's true. You need to be able to solve problems, but if all you can do is solve problems and you don't understand the material underneath, very, very hard to perform well on an exam. With that said, I like to say that when I'm thinking about my students, I actually want to help you develop systems or help you teach yourself how to build these skills by active reflecting. One of the things that I think is an unaddressed component of college education is that we don't ever, well, in my classes, I was never taught how to take tests. It was just assumed that if I showed up to lecture, test was on week 4, I'd show up, and then if I was doing well in the course, I'd do well on the test. In my opinion, that's a learned skill. All of test taking are learned skills in my experience, and then also working with students. The test corrections process is your chance to really trying to sink your teeth into your current level of performance and analyze what went well for you on the test and also what you could have done better. I like to think about that as a 3-step cycle, and I'm actually going to lead you through this together with an example. Let's do this as a team. Before I go through any of the specifics, could someone read just that first thing in the box there? And I might have someone with a strong voice like Joe, real loud.
Read every word of this document.
If you plan to submit corrections. I'm giving you an opportunity. I grade every exam twice. So I just graded your first draft. That took me literally 8 hours over 5 days. I had to take a break because I was tired at the end of every one. This is the longest I spent. I don't know, maybe it's because I've been away from 2B for a while, or I was taking it really seriously. Now that you have it back, you have a chance to get me to regrade it and assign a second draft grade. If you plan on having me give you that attention, I expect you to have read every word of this document and to respect the requests that I'm making in this. This is a huge undertaking on my part as an instructor. Usually the test corrections take me another 4 to 5 hours per class. And I just ask that, and this document literally is probably about a 50-hour draft. I update this document every single quarter I teach it. I make changes, et cetera, et cetera. I really appreciate it. It'd probably take you 1.5 hours to read through this and think about it critically, so please do read that. What I wanted to do is to actually work through just all the different steps of this. My exam correction process has 6 steps in it. There are 6 different things that I want you to achieve. This comes from actually a technique that I used to use as a student, and I actually assumed that all students did this. One of the things that I remember doing in every single exam that I took at UCSB and later on at UC Davis, when I got my exam back, within the first 2 days of getting that graded paper, I would have found all the correct solutions to every problem that I missed. Generally, I didn't wait until I got the exam back. Anybody have the experience where you finish the exam and you know exactly which problems you missed and you know the mistakes that you made within the first 3 hours? I generally would write those down so that when I got the graded stuff back, I was off to a head start. After I went through all the corrections, I then analyzed the different types of mistakes that I made, and then I would make an appointment with my professor that week that I got the exam back, the next week and the week after that, to recalibrate my study skills so that as I got ready for the second draft, there was no confusion about the techniques that I should be using given the context of the class. And the reason that I like to have the professor's feedback is when I was in class, the professor was lecturing, but it wasn't always clear based on lecture what that person actually expected about performance and about preparation. I found that there was a non-trivial interpolation that had to happen between this professor's expectations and the way that I heard their words in lecture. And that interpolation meant that I had to customize my study techniques based on the paradigms of the instructor. So I always thought to myself, if the instructor's the one writing the test, they probably have an exact algorithm for the way they're thinking about how I should study, and that algorithm is not clear to me, especially in lectures where they don't talk about it. I also know on my own end, I have an algorithm for the way that I would approach this class, and the challenge of every performance is to make sure that those 2 different plans aligned so that I can maximize or get the best grade that I can given my understanding in the class. When I missed something on a test, I always felt like I was paying. So you could imagine that every 50 points on a test, that's like $50,000. And if I miss 10 points on a test, I have now paid $10,000 out of my pocket. And I used to think about that order of magnitude. And I paid for something really important. My opinion was I paid for the lesson. If I missed 10 points on a test, there were 10 points worth of mistakes that I made on that I paid for. You ever heard this? Only cry once when you pay for something? You cry up front and then never cry again? My feeling was every chance that I got to pay for a mistake, that was the last time I would ever pay for that particular type of mistake. So from that point forward, from the day I got that back, for the rest of my education, I made a dedication to myself, if possible, I would never make that type of mistake on an exam again. I might make other mistakes. I might, mess up on some other aspect of the class, but that mistake was now out of my repertoire. But in order to get to a place where I could make that commitment and have that level of surety, I needed to do some very deep thinking. I didn't think about it at the time of calling that exam corrections because it was just me. I also assumed that every single student that was in every one of my classes was doing this. I was quite surprised when I came to Foothill. Did I tell you the first, it was actually not at Foothill, it was at UC Davis. Did I tell you about this? First time I ever graded a midterm as a teacher. I spent like if I spent 8 hours on this, I probably spent 16 hours. I gave really, really detailed comments to every mistake. I printed out like worksheets on stuff. And I gave the exams back, and you know what happened right when I walked out the door? 2 people had thrown in the recycling. I mean, it made me really sad from the standpoint I just spent 16 hours, but it made me even more sad for those particular students because basically what I just learned from that experience was they didn't even value their own mistakes. They literally thought about that grade as the grade that they got and no more. And from that standpoint, from that point forward, I realized that it was not a systemic feature of education that all students were analyzing mistakes on all their exams. In fact, it was the exception to the rule, not the standard. I found very, very few students were actually doing this systemically at UC Davis, and then when I got to Foothill, the same thing is true. My first few years here, I was always surprised at how few students would actually go back through their exams and correct them. And I thought to myself, well, why is this? And what I learned was, in college we have this, you've heard of Pavlov's dog? Where we ring a bell and the thing salivates? Our bells are called grades. And the action that we teach our students to do is to jump through whatever hoop is necessary to get those grades. But the moment that the grade is set, do you know what our students do?
Don't care.
Because it's incentivized in the system that why would I go back and do something if I'm not going to get credit for it? Well, that always makes me laugh because if you're not analyzing the mistakes that you're making and you're not protecting yourself against those mistakes in the future, how are you going to make sure that those things don't show up again? And I think that's why many times students will, struggle on one exam, struggle on the next exam, and have made no changes in their study habits. And then a lot of students will make a reflection, oh, it must be me. When really it's not them, it's the fact that they've never actually sat down and thought about what did I just go through? Why did I go through that? What could I do differently in the next few weeks so I don't face that? With that in mind, the exam corrections process that I'm showing you is a systematized version of the reflections that I found really, really helpful as a student. And then I also think in studying top performance, I make a hobby of studying what you might call world-class performers. It's something that is just interesting to me. One of the things that I find in many, many aspects of world-class performance is the process of reflection. This particular exercise is designed to have reflection on STEM exams.